After the mutinies had been put down, Germanicus invaded Germany. This is how Cassius Dio puts it. Germanicus, being afraid that they would fall to rioting again, invaded the enemy's country and tarried there, giving the troops plenty of work and food in abundance. Cassius Dio summarizes the German campaign. Later on in Book 57, Germanicus advanced as far as the ocean, inflicted an overwhelming defeat upon the barbarians, collected and buried the bones of those who had fallen with Varus, and won back the military standards. So it seems that the campaign served this purpose of keeping the troops occupied and avenging the massacre of the Teutoburg forest, but Tiberius recalled him from Germany before he could accomplish anything more than that. Tacitus tells us that Germanicus asked for another year to complete the job, but Tiberius instructed Germanicus to return for the triumph that had been voted to him. Suetonius tells us about the popularity of Germanicus here. He was so popular with the masses that, according to many writers, whenever he came to any place or left one, he was sometimes in danger of his life from the crowds that met him or saw him off. So this can only have forced Tiberius to be ever conscious that he was not well loved by the Roman people when he can see the far superior admiration that Germanicus enjoyed. And we have a great anecdote from Suetonius. Who knows if it's true? But he writes, Tiberius was roused from sleep by the cries of the rejoicing throng, who all united in singing, "Safe is Rome, safe to our country, for Germanicus is safe." This is the sort of anecdote that must have amused posterity, because Tiberius is no better loved in retrospect than he was contemporaneously. No one likes Tiberius. And the idea that a throng can rouse him in the middle of the night via their admiration for someone who he must have viewed as something of a rival is a delightful penetration of the ivory tower of monarchy. The next thing that happens is that Germanicus is sent to deal with the issues in the east. Now, Tacitus believes that Tiberius assigned him to the east for the purpose of eliminating him. He writes, he decided to find honorable excuses for the young man's elimination. Some pretexts were invented, others happened to be available. So Tiberius invited the king of Cappadocia to Rome, and the king died. And two other regions in Armenia needed new kings as well. So we have these three vacancies. And Tacitus tells us that to deal with this, the Senate entrusted the overseas provinces to Germanicus with powers superior, wherever he might go, to those of all governors. But at the same time, Tiberius replaced the governor of Syria with a man named Cnaeus Calpurnius Piso, who Tacitus says was ferocious and insubordinate, and adds, Piso was certain that the purpose of his Syrian appointment was the repression of Germanicus's ambitions. Here's what happened. The East was indeed a volatile place. We know this from reading Josephus, the Jewish historian who wrote the Jewish Wars. The Armenian king Vonones was actually the former king of the Parthians. He tells us, upon the supposal that this man was not worthy to be their governor, they presently invited Artabanus, king of Media, to be their king, he being also of the race of Arsaces. These Parthians are like the English, apparently, always in search of foreign kings of their own lineage. Artabanus had to defeat Vonones by force, and Vonones went to Armenia, asked to be made king, was refused by Tiberius, and the kingdom was bestowed by Artabanus to his own son. So we can see that Rome and Parthia are vying for king-making power over the eastern nations. So this isn't just trivialities that Germanicus is being sent to deal with. That being said, he doesn't seem to have had a very difficult task. Tacitus writes, popular feeling, that is amongst the Armenians, among high and low alike, favored Zeno, the son of King Polemo I of Pontus. What a carousel of kings. You know, Parthia is bringing in the king of Media. That gets rid of Vonones. He says, oh, fine, I'll go to plan B. I'll be king of Armenia. And that doesn't work out, and Armenia goes and takes the king of Pontus. It's like the end of a sports season when everyone changes coaches. But the carousel eventually came to a halt, and Tacitus writes that Germanicus had solved every Eastern question, right? So after a series of new coronations and annexations, all of the problems have been solved. But the issue is that when he had requested troops from Piso, when he went to Armenia, he was not given them. The two men hated each other. Tacitus writes, finally, at the winter quarters of the 10th Brigade at Cyrrhus, they met. Germanicus spoke first with ill-concealed indignation. Piso apologized. Insolently, they parted in undeclared enmity. And Suetonius confirms, he never ceased to show the bitterest enmity towards Germanicus in word and deed. That is Piso, who never ceased. Germanicus next makes a tour of Egypt, and in describing this, Tacitus writes a bit like Plutarch, romantically recalling those ancient times. Germanicus inspected the imposing remains of Thebes. On its massive masonry in Egyptian writing are testimonies to ancient splendor. One of the priests, requested to interpret the native tongue, told how the country had once possessed 700,000 men of military age, with whom Ramses II had made his conquests. The stone statue of Memnon, which gives out the sound of a voice when the sun's rays strike it, the pyramids, mountainous monuments of royal competition and wealth, erected on drifting and almost pathless sands, artificial lakes to receive the Nile's overflow. So we hear that wistfulness that historians bring to the distant past, and Tacitus is not unaware of how he is presenting this story. Here we have our tragic hero contemplating previous great men along with astonishing civic achievements, who shortly after this returns to Syria, where he writes, Germanicus learnt that all his orders to divisional commanders in cities had been cancelled or reversed. Between him and Piso, there were violent reciprocal denunciations. Isn't that amazing storytelling by Tacitus? A leader worthy of an ancient civilized past, brought into antagonism with an unscrupulous idiot, hack, Piso. After these reciprocal denunciations, it is now that Germanicus falls ill. Piso left Antioch and went to a city on the southern coast of what is modern-day Turkey. Piso waited for news on Germanicus's health. Tacitus tells us that Germanicus sent him a note. It is possible that this note told him to leave, that he was fired as governor. We don't know that for sure. The way I read this, and I could be wrong, is that the note informed him of Germanicus's complete recovery, prematurely, of course. And so he said, forget this, I'm not going back there. This guy thinks I poisoned him. I'm going home where I'm safe with my emperor. But we do know that Piso sailed away from Syria. So, legally speaking, this would roughly constitute his resignation as governor of Syria. And shortly afterwards, Germanicus died in Antioch, convinced that he was poisoned. Tacitus tells us that they found the remains of human bodies, spells, curses, lead tablets in the floor and walls of his bedroom, which paints a morbid picture and reminds us almost of like a voodoo. And it captures the imagination. The BBC series, I, Claudius, had some real fun with this. You know, the skull of an African with a hand in it and all this other weird stuff. But Tacitus still writes, it is uncertain if the body showed signs of poisoning. So despite all this macabre paraphernalia, Tacitus is unconvinced of the poisoning. Cassius Dio disagrees. He writes in Book 57 that poison was the means of his carrying off was revealed by the condition of his body, which was brought into the forum and exhibited to all who were present. And Suetonius writes, after he had been reduced to ashes, his heart was found entire among his bones, and it is supposed to be a characteristic of that organ that when steeped in poison, it cannot be destroyed by fire. Okay, so this is in the year 19 AD. That Germanicus has died. The mourning of his death is inaccessible to us. The extent of this nationwide sorrow we cannot access. Tacitus tells us that people came from great distances to erect altars on the route that his ashes took on their way to Rome, carried by his widow Agrippina. Tacitus goes so far as to compare Germanicus with Alexander the Great. Tacitus writes, his statues and cult centers were almost innumerable. Piso's behavior was not so sad. Temples were visited, victims sacrificed in an orgy of celebration, and his wife Plancina, who was supposed to be already in mourning for the death of her sister, is said to have exchanged her mourning garb for festive. And back in Syria, Piso had been replaced as governor by the senators and other officials who were still there. They appointed somebody named Sentius. But Piso decides he wants to reinstall himself as governor by force. He recruits an army from deserters and Cilicians. He fights against Sentius and loses quickly. The suspense only lasted as long as it took to climb a hill, says Tacitus. His Cilicians bolted and locked themselves in a town. Piso was given a naval escort to return to Rome. He should have been embarrassed. He seems not to have been. He landed in good cheer, but was soon accused of poisoning Germanicus as well as treason for invading a Roman province. Tacitus writes, "The accused was not sorry." Now Tiberius was in an awkward situation when it comes to this trial that is coming, this trial of Piso, which was referred to the Senate, because the public believed that he himself, that is Emperor Tiberius, had been behind the poisoning. And all three historians that we are using agree that this was the public sentiment. Tacitus writes, "Never had there been so much intense public interest and so much private criticism and unspoken suspicion of the emperor." Now, legally speaking, this was an easy case because invading Syria with this ragtag army was treason. Politically speaking, however, it must have been important to Tiberius that he either be, this is Piso, either be condemned of the poisoning, or that the poisoning would be ruled out entirely. Otherwise, it's him, right? Otherwise, it looks like it's him. And the last part, the part about the poisoning, is a little ridiculous. It seemed fantastic, Tacitus writes, that he should have attempted this with many people looking on and under Germanicus's own eyes. The only way he could have done it himself, the only opportunity he had was at this dinner party, and everyone doubts that this was possible. They already hated each other. All right, adding to the public distrust is the fact that both the emperor and Piso refused to produce private correspondence. This is why it was believed that Tiberius had arranged Germanicus's death. If the intention had been to poison Germanicus and frame Piso like a political fall guy, it wasn't well executed at all. Piso was found with his throat cut. It is believed but not known that he killed himself. Tacitus includes these rumors, which he says reached his own ears from those who had been alive at the time. "I remember hearing older men speak of a document often seen in Piso's hands. He never made it known, but his friends insisted that it contained a letter from Tiberius with instructions related to Germanicus." The implication being that Tiberius had sent direct orders, either that Piso poisoned Germanicus or some sort of correspondence that told him to expect that Germanicus would be poisoned. Something to implicate Tiberius. Now, we might wonder the truth of this. Suppose it was made known that Tiberius had ordered the death. What would have happened? He was absolute ruler. But the historians agree that the death of Germanicus was a turning point in the reign of Tiberius, after which he began to reveal his violent nature.